Okay, so with us for this one, we have our Newcastle United writer, Chris Waugh. Chris, you look like a man that's been typing away for the last few days covering Newcastle United. All right, break it down to us. How much work have Newcastle had to do to comply with PSR?
So it's over weekends like the one that's just been that gives me a small insight into what it's like to be David Ornstein all the time, and it must be a very very difficult life. It was a very fraught weekend, and if I look tired and my mind maybe scrambled after the weekend, just imagine what people inside Newcastle United have been like. Because speaking to several people, they've described it as possibly the most stressful week of their entire footballing careers, because it has been that difficult situation, and I don't think any of us or anyone externally actually realised how much up against they were until after the fact. And Newcastle woke up, the figures inside Newcastle woke up on Saturday morning with no deals at that stage actually fully lined up, despite having tried to for several weeks. And at that stage, with less than 48 hours to go, they faced a black hole in the region of 50 to 60 million pounds in their PSR calculation. And in the end, the actual end sort of seems fairly reasonable in terms of, if you look at what Newcastle have actually done, they've sold Yankuba Minteh, albeit a very, very exciting young winger, but someone who's never made a first-team appearance for them. They've sold Elliot Anderson, an academy graduate who they rate very, very highly, but who hadn't scored a goal for them and wasn't going to be first-choice midfielder, and have brought in around about 60-odd million pounds for those two, plus they've eventually managed to bring in some compensation for Dan Ashworth, who'd been on gardening leave for more than 4 months, going to Manchester United. So the ends seem to be decent, but the means of getting there and the scramble Newcastle have had, the unsettling nature of the last week, the fact that Newcastle got themselves into the position in the first place, I think the fallout from that is still being felt, and the optics have been pretty poor. And for a fan base who I think were already a bit deflated after Newcastle didn't get into European competition when Manchester United ended up winning the FA Cup, and that deprived them of a position they thought they'd be in. This is just another negative on what really is a very important summer for them going into next season and their bid to try and get back into the Champions League for the season afterwards.
Yeah, you talk about David Ornstein. He's due to join us very soon, and as you can say, as you've said, he's very busy at the moment. So we'll see what we can get out of him in terms of the dealings. But I mean, you're saying this to me, and all season long we've been talking about PSR, right? We've seen what's happened to Everton, we've seen what's happened to Nottingham Forest in terms of point deduction. Why is it such a surprise that it's got to this point when Newcastle are going, "Oh goodness me, how are we so sure?" You know, in the current state of things, PSR is a massive, massive thing in the Premier League.
It is, and questions are rightly being asked by supporters, and someone other than just Eddie Howe, the head coach, needs to come out and explain. And the suggestion from Newcastle United is that somebody will, but this is down to decisions which have been made over the course of a 3-year period. The accounts that have just been the 3-year rolling period, which count towards the PSR calculation, for the first time count 3 years of post-takeover spending. And given the low revenue base Newcastle came from at the start, PSR was always something that was in their minds. But whenever it was sort of either briefed out or even said on the record from someone at Newcastle that PSR is governing part of their transfer policy, at least a portion of the fan base then didn't come to believe it, because a big deal just seemed to come along the way. They spent big on Alexander Isak. They brought in Anthony Gordon. They signed Sandro Tonali for a heck of a lot of money. And people start to think this is just a negotiating ploy. But the reality was decisions taken, and Newcastle's inability to sell well until this weekend. They brought in, whereas they'd spent about £420 million on incoming signings over the course of those 3 seasons. They'd brought in less than 50 million, and that has been part of their issue. In a PSR world, the clubs who bounce the books well sell well. Newcastle didn't, partly because of the after effect of the Mike Ashley era, that they didn't actually have many saleable assets they would want to sell, and otherwise they'd have to sell first team players. But at some point they had to trade. They were in this position. They left it to the last minute, and in January it seemed that they had to sell to buy. That was seemingly the impression given, but actually the reality was they had to sell anyway, and they didn't. They failed to get anyone out, and the decisions were basically deferred till this summer, where they've had this mad scramble, and in the end they seem to have just about scraped through, but they were facing a potential double-digit points deduction. That's what they feared going into this weekend, given the sort of scale of the potential breach they were looking at.
Yeah, Chris, you were talking about players like Isak, and we sort of semi-floated, last season how potentially players like Isak, Gordon, key players, Guimaraes to a certain degree, might need to be sold. You talk about this deficit that Newcastle have in terms of PSR. How close were they to just saying, do you know what? We'll get 60 million for Isak. We're clean, or did they have a real strategy at play?
Well, I think a strange sort of positive, which turned out to be a negative from a particular PSR point of view, was in the early part of the spring. I think there was the expectation that someone may exercise Bruno Guimaraes' £100 million release clause. And although Newcastle didn't want to lose him, if that had happened, that would have put them in a far better PSR position. But once it seemed that the Bruno Guimaraes was going to stay around, that was a positive in a footballing sense and what the club wanted. But then there's still this black hole that they had to sort of fill. Now, opportunistic clubs who sort of got wind of the fact that Newcastle needed to sell then put out like feelers, and there were conversations with Chelsea and Newcastle about Alexander Isak. Now, Newcastle in no way wanted to lose Alexander Isak, and at one point it almost seemed like it was anyone but Isak, and that's where the sort of Anthony Gordon and Liverpool conversations may have arisen from. And Newcastle didn't want to lose Anthony Gordon, but they were in such a desperate situation that they had to consider just about everything barring Isak, and that is where I think supporters have been so alarmed by this. That Gordon was pivotal to everything Newcastle achieved last season. He was one of the best players in the Premier League, and alongside Isak, he's sort of like the shining light of the future for Newcastle. And to have got into a position where they actually had to consider potentially letting him go, however fleeting that was, that just shows how fraught the whole situation was.
Yeah, David, you've arrived at the right time. We're talking transfers. You've probably heard, Isak's name's been mentioned, Gordon's name's been mentioned. And before you arrived, we were talking about Elliot Anderson and Yankuba Minteh as well. I mean, I just want to get from your perspective, especially with your ears to the ground, just how desperate Newcastle were to try and offload players to try and balance the books in terms of PSR.
Yeah, it was tense towards the end, Ayo. It had an element of chaos to it because whatever Newcastle were trying was not materializing. They didn't have offers on the table or situations developing, which is why actually they escalated the conversations with Manchester United over Dan Ashworth. And a compensation deal was eventually agreed pretty much on Friday, ahead of the Sunday PSR deadline. Everybody thought it would be solved through player sales, but in the end, it was the Ashworth deal that contributed quite significantly to that. And at that moment in time, that looked like a more credible outcome than what was to follow. Thankfully for Newcastle, the Minteh situation did resolve itself. They managed to get a deal in place with Brighton. There was some suggestion that maybe Nottingham Forest could be in the frame. He had already turned down Lyon. And it was Saturday evening, wasn't it, when I broke the news of Brighton, and that was a huge relief to Newcastle United because approaching that moment, they were looking into all sorts. As Chris outlines, the Anthony Gordon situation, reluctantly might have been a route that they would have gone down. It was an arm's length inquiry from Liverpool some weeks ago. He's a player they admire. It then went quiet, but sort of came back to the fore. As Newcastle scrambled around, they would have been looking into all manner of possibilities. Could the Saudi Pro League take one or two of their players? Well, they haven't really got their summer window up and running yet. I don't think it's even opened, and they're still sort of trying to finalize budgets. Who else? Sean Longstaff. I'm not sure that was a credible possibility, but sure, look into anything that could potentially help you in this situation. Anderson was always a name that was bubbling around to me for months, actually, all the way back to January as being a potential solution, but he had an injury, so it seemed that might scupper the possibility. But yeah, it was not a pleasant situation, and the word around football was that it's a mess at Newcastle, and there's some really good people working there, and it's not to blame them. It's just the situation, the system that's in place that the authorities have allowed to develop, you could say, where clubs are having to sell homegrown talent to try and balance the books. You could say the clubs should have their own houses in order, and then they wouldn't have to. But it's not a it's not a pretty picture, and it really wasn't at Newcastle, but they managed to scrape their way out of it. And it's important to mention that the PSR situation is changing. The rules are moving from aggregated losses to squad cost controls. So this time next year will be a very different methodology. On top of these squad cost controls, there will be something called anchoring. I'm not going to go into the detail of it all now, but if we weren't confused by it all to this point, it's about to get a lot worse. But the authorities and clubs will hope that it becomes better once the new system kicks into gear. It will fall more in line with how UEFA operate, and maybe there will come a time where you and I are not speaking about PSR every time we come on an athletic football podcast.
I'm praying for that day. Let's just get on with the football. But Chris, just from your perspective, this Minteh deal, it's really fascinating actually, and seemed like a really complex deal. Bear in mind the lad's a Newcastle player, but was playing a Feyenoord on loan, and obviously they needed to sell him, but from Lyon to Everton, I mean, who wanted this lad, and why didn't he end up in either of those teams?
Well, Minteh was signed last year by Newcastle from Odense in Denmark, and it was actually, ironically, Dan Ashworth, one of the people who pushed for that as Newcastle sporting director. Now, there's a lot of some people have pointed to the fact that in terms of bringing money in, a sporting director is important for that. And during his actual tenure, when he wasn't on garden leave, there wasn't enough money brought in. But the irony is that the Dan Ashworth, both him moving to Manchester United and also that the Minteh deal and the profit Newcastle have made there in the end has really aided them. But it was sort of maybe in the spring that Newcastle sort of had three options they were thinking about for Minteh, given how well he'd done at Feyenoord. It looked most likely at that stage he could go out on loan again the upcoming season to try and gain further experience. Eddie Howe was keen to look at him during pre-season and see whether they would get an opportunity there, but Newcastle are trying to sign a right winger, so it was look likely there's opportunities to be limited, and once they didn't reach Europe, that seemed unlikely as well. And then the third option was, well, if he is worth a fair amount of money, if we can get a decent amount, we could make some PSR profit here and bring and sell him on. And so as of basically the start of June, Minteh was really identified as one of the players who could really aid them. And at one stage, it looked like he was the one Newcastle were banking on. But even if they'd sold him for slightly more money to Lyon, it still wouldn't have solved the PSR black hole. So yes, Newcastle had been in conversation with Everton. Dominic Calvert-Lewin would have potentially been coming the other way, but that failed to materialise, largely seemingly due to personal terms, but also maybe slight disagreements over the fee. And then once Lyon had put a valuation, which was supposedly around £40 million, nobody's quite sure exactly how a French club who are cash-strapped could have offered that. But once they offered that, Newcastle's valuation was far too high for most of the other clubs interested, and that's why it came down to sort of the 11th hour. Everton was still interested but couldn't afford him. Nottingham Forest asked the question. There was other interest in Europe, but eventually Brighton, who looked at Minteh before he went to Newcastle last year, came in, and Newcastle managed to reach an agreement with him. Minteh wanted to stay in the Premier League. He didn't want to go to Lyon. That's why that deal did not progress. And as far as the situation was, he was on holiday in Gambia, which is where he's from, but he flew back to the UK on Saturday, seemingly, and managed to get the deal through. And that was really the first breakthrough before then Anderson came not long afterwards. And that Saturday night really solved Newcastle's problems.
Well, David, we keep talking numbers, we keep talking PSL, we keep talking about balance in the books, but in the midst of all of this are players, right, who might not know where they might be in the next couple of weeks, next month, next season. Am I on loan? Am I being sold? I mean, there's got to be something here about player welfare. I mean, they aren't just trading cards, there are human beings behind all of this.
Yeah, that was part of this Minteh situation that didn't sit comfortably with me and many others I speak to. And it's not just him, but similar for other players in these equations too. Now, before we give too much sympathy, this is sort of high-level sport and Premier League football, and people are being paid well, etc. But when you saw reports about, Newcastle telling him he would be spending next season with the development squad if he doesn't make this move, I couldn't help thinking, like, what's he done wrong to deserve it? What did he do to offend them? Just because they're finding themselves in a financial predicament and they've decided that he is the solution to that, he's free to make his own decisions. The idea that he has to help them out. Well, no, I'm not sure that's the case. If it suits him, yeah, absolutely. And that wasn't ideal, especially for a player who I've heard really good things about. People who watched him at Feyenoord, but also recruitment experts and scouts and people who have studied him closer than me. Brighton, clearly, and Nottingham Forest, Everton, Lyon, clubs that really wanted to sign him. And I think there's a feeling that Brighton have got themselves one hell of a player and prospect. But it brings us back to this overall picture that PSR has created, selling homegrown products for pure profit, and situations sort of arising out of nowhere. We saw Amari Kellyman, a player that was very happy at Aston Villa, and Villa rate him extremely highly, suddenly sold to Chelsea. Now, it's not the worst deal in the world. Otherwise, I would like to think he wouldn't have agreed to it. He's going to a massive club and an exciting project. We see Lewis Dobbin leaving Everton, and Tim, for the second week running, moving in the opposite direction. And, a lot of these players are very settled where they are. They are young. They might not want to be part of this movement. And that made me feel like there's a bit of sort of shifting of chess pieces and commodities. You call it trading cards. One player in the market at the moment who may have moved was described to me by another club as being treated like a slave, the way that the club were approaching the situation. And that sort of terminology, is really not pleasant. And so I think a lot of reflection needs to take place when looking back on the period that we've now come through. And fingers crossed, it's going to be slightly more relaxed in the rest of the market now that it's a new PSR cycle. And then we're going to be switching to the alternative method going forward. And also finances are a bit more secure and some proper deals can happen, because so many of my conversations over recent months have not been about the football player or the football or how the player will fit into the footballing methodology and team shape and structure and plans for him on the pitch. It was all about how can we make it work financially? Who can we switch? And I do think one interesting element is that player swaps, it didn't used to be done very often in England, at least, because it was so difficult to marry up the transfer fees, the valuations, the salaries, the agents' commissions. Clubs just veered away from it. It was seen as being too complicated. Now it seems all the rage because cash flow is in short supply for many clubs. Even at Tottenham, where they didn't have a PSR problem, they had a cash flow problem, and so they couldn't pay the sort of fees we were seeing even last summer. A Declan Rice for £100+ million, and Harry Kane, similar sort of valuations, and a number of others. The list goes on. Now we're having to see players put into these deals to make it happen, right up until this last 24 hours or so, with Archie Gray moving from Leeds United to Tottenham, and Joe Rodon going in the opposite direction. And people I speak to suggest that is going to continue to be a feature, that players get put into these to make it all work from a monetary perspective. And so that's a fresh dynamic we're looking like we're seeing in the transfer market.
Okay, I want to touch on this idea of the swap deals in just a second, David, but very quickly, Chris, in terms of Newcastle and their PSR predicament, I'm still looking at teams like of Chelsea still buying one or two players. Like, how, the average fan's like, how are Chelsea able to do that kind of business and Newcastle aren't able to do that kind of business? What's the fundamental difference here?
Well, I sort of touched upon it earlier on, but part of it is the fact that Newcastle had not been bringing in sort of money themselves, which everyone who listens to these podcasts will have become more and more aware of the word amortization. And when you bring in a player, when you sign the player at that period of time, you don't book in your accounts for that year the full amount of it. You spread it over the length of a 5-year contract. But when you sell a player, you can then put it immediately, the full value, into your account. And because Newcastle hadn't been selling enough, they haven't been able to do that. Now, Chelsea have sold some players, albeit they still have had PSR issues. But because they've sold some, they can then spend what seems to be a heck of a lot lot more money because they have that money coming in at that stage, and then they can amortize the rest. Newcastle haven't been in that position, and also the fact that it was the cumulative losses that they had of around 144 million for the 2 seasons before the one that we've just had, and not all of that counts towards PSR, but a large part of it does. And so if you look at that, and if Newcastle can only lose 105 million pounds over a 3-year rolling period, they were always in a borderline crisis situation. And so they just didn't, when David talks about cash flow, that to a certain degree is the situation Newcastle were in. They couldn't put money down. And that's part of the reason why last summer, when they signed Lewis Hall, it was on a loan with an obligation to buy because they couldn't afford to put more down this year, and they needed the money to go into the following year's accounts. The same in January, when they were looking to sign because they had such of a midfield injury crisis, most of the deals they were looking at were loans or obligations to buy, and most clubs were looking at it and saying, no, we want money now, and that was part of the issue they had.
How does this now affect summer dealings now? The sort of PSR accounting period has sort of changed. Newcastle haven't been able to buy a lot at all last season. Eddie Howe had his hands tied, really. What does this look like for Newcastle now going into a new window?
Theoretically, they are past that June 30th deadline and into what is a fresh accounting year. The first year that drops off is that first post-takeover year of 2020-21. 21-22, sorry, when Newcastle lost 70.7 million and had spent more than 100 million pounds in the January window. That means that loss comes off the books, which gives them a bit of room in itself there. Newcastle's revenues are also higher now than they were then, which, given the amount of losses you can make relative to how much you spend, that works out well for them. Plus, they have the Adidas sponsorship deal, the front shirt sponsor, which is worth about 7 or 8 times what the previous one was. That comes on and expands their avenues going forward. So given the money they managed to bring in the end, towards the end of last year's accounting period, that should really aid them. And they are still restricted by PSR. They remain in that position. They don't have the revenues of the so-called Big Six, but there should be far greater capacity to spend now between now and the end of the actual summer window.
Well, David, he did touch on it earlier, this idea of swap deals with players. The deal that took Elliot Anderson to Nottingham Forest did also involve a swap deal of sorts with Vlachodimos, the Greek goalkeeper, going the other way. Now, the people at the heart of this are the Premier League. What has their reaction been?
And so this communication from the Premier League, it was pretty detailed from what we hear, just running through the rules and regulations and what can and can't be done and how clubs should behave in the transfer market and their responsibilities. It's a really complicated picture, and these swaps don't help because it's not just one movement happening, it's multiple, and there can be so many factors involved in it as well that make it quite a messy picture. It has been seen on the continent for quite some time. It brings some quite uncomfortable comparisons to what we saw with Juventus and Barcelona some years ago, with players moving in opposite directions, and I think there were some repercussions from that. And we don't want to see clubs being investigated for their transfers retrospectively. I've spoken to Premier League clubs who have not been involved in these swap deals, like the Forest, the Villa, the Chelsea, the Newcastle, and they're looking at it and saying something's not right in these. The Premier League are going to pay close attention to it. The clubs aren't happy, and I don't want to name the specific deals, but you can see them all there. That are raising eyebrows around the competition. But I think the bottom line here is that the Premier League vets the deals before approving them. They are not breaking any rules, it would appear, unless people are not acting in good faith and it's investigated and they're found not to be doing so. I think they are capitalizing, taking advantage of using a system that's in place, and you could say that's quite clever, and you would in any walk of life. It may be that the authorities, the Premier League in this case, need to tighten up a little bit. If they've got concern, they need to pay closer attention to it. They may look to scrutinize the communications between the two clubs. That's something I hear echoing around Premier League circles. Was there really a bidding war for this player? Were other clubs truly in? Were there alternative offers that help you decipher what is fair market value and the going rate for them to have got to that price? And it will be interesting to see if the Premier League starts to cave to pressure from other clubs and requests or demands the communications, messages, calls being released to understand what's gone on here. But I think by and large, it seems the compliance is there. Otherwise, you'd be surprised. Maybe I'm being naive here. You'd be surprised if the deals were sanctioned in the first place. But for the good of the competition, the transparency, the integrity, that old phrase about, the public trusting what they're seeing, then maybe going forward, it just needs to be a little clearer and a little bit more closely regulated and guarded by the powers that be.
Yeah. Now, Chris, we spoke about it earlier. Dan Ashworth, also a key figure in pushing to sign Yankuba Minteh, another transfer, not a football player, but, backroom who does the business, going over to Manchester United at this moment in time. From a Newcastle perspective, how big a loss is this for Newcastle and the ambition they want to show moving forward?
I think that the way that that really has become, that had become a saga, I think the way that has played out has been damaging in the end. Mid-season, when Newcastle are going through what clearly turned out to be a really difficult struggle to comply with PSR, they lost the sporting director, who has a key role in transfers and making sure that Newcastle are looking at that situation going forward, the likes of contracts and ins and outs. And Newcastle have had him on garden leave since February, before this deal was finally agreed, just heading in towards the end of June for him to actually move to Manchester United. And Newcastle have not had a sporting director since. They've basically reverted to a similar model they had in the first transfer window post takeover, which is that the ownership plus Eddie Howe to a certain degree, and then Steve Nixon, the head of recruitment, Eddie Howe, the deputy head of recruitment, and then also this time the CEO they have in place in Darren Eales have been focusing on those transfer dealings. And although they're confident that's a good structure that they have in place, you want a sporting director. They make long-term decisions for the football club, and Newcastle don't have one at this stage. They went through an exhaustive process. They brought in an external recruitment firm, and Dougie Freedman of Crystal Palace was eventually identified as the person they wanted, but they moved for him, and he said no. And that in itself, the optics of that were poor. That's another sort of negative that Newcastle have had over the course of the last few weeks, that Crystal Palace, albeit an established Premier League club, but one who basically finished mid-table most seasons, this supposed really exciting project at Newcastle couldn't prize him away. And Johannes Spors of the 777 group, who tried to buy Everton, he was second in line for the role seemingly, but nothing has progressed as of yet on that stage, although conversations have continued. And really, Newcastle don't seem to have progressed on that regard. They need to sort it. Now that Ashworth has actually moved on, they will look to accelerate that process. But for a club who have got themselves in the PSR situation that they did, to not have a sporting director who sorts out the sporting side of things for the long term and really looks at these things in place, is not a great look and doesn't necessarily bode well. So it is a situation that need resolved.
Yeah, well, David, the sporting side of things is something Sir Jim Radcliffe definitely had his eye on, especially how he wants to get Manchester United back firing. And they've got their man, Dan Ashworth. I'm just wondering what this means now for Manchester United moving forward in terms of the transfer window. Look, I was looking at the deal sheet, our weekly guide to what's happening in the summer transfer window. And there's a certain Dutch centre-back that is being linked with a move to Manchester United under Erik ten Hag once again.
Yeah, so first and foremost, to pick up on Chris's line about the sporting director situation, it was not really satisfactory for anybody to have Dan Ashworth potentially out of work until, what was it going to be, the summer of 2025? As per the terms of his contract and notice period. Newcastle would be paying him full salary to sit digging up weeds, and Manchester United would be waiting for him to come in, not benefiting from the services that somebody is going to be giving to them long term, they would like to think. And Dan Ashworth would want to work. And in most other industries, you would get this done and dusted and move on. It seemed they were no closer to an agreement for a long time. It was going to go to arbitration. And finally, it came to sensible outcome, I think, which was forced, it seems, by PSR. And now, to great surprise, actually, I would say, across the industry, Dan Ashworth begins with Manchester United today, as we're recording this.
Wow.
At what's essentially the start of the summer transfer window. He hasn't missed much time at all. I think there was a consensus that if Newcastle get their way, the very earliest he will start is after this summer's transfer window. So Man United will be delighted with this. And they can start attacking their potential recruitment possibilities, which are not easy given their financial situation. But they now have a pretty much full squad in place. So it's Omar Barada as chief executive starting on the 13th of July. Jason Wilcox is already in the building. Dan Ashworth there now too. And the other story that we broke is that Christopher Vivell, formerly of Chelsea and RB Leipzig, is coming in to help with their recruitment on an initial short-term basis for this summer window. And then let's see what the future brings. And he's experienced in player recruitment, talent ID, and even the multi-club model if he stays at Manchester United for longer, given his Red Bull background. And yes, one of the targets that they've been looking at for some time, I think led by Erik ten Hag most recently, because he managed him at Ajax, is Matthijs de Ligt. He's somebody that's been on Manchester United's radar for some years. When he was at Ajax, emerging as a teenager, we remember their run to the Champions League semi-final when they lost to Tottenham, and he was a key part of that. I think he was captain. Went to Juventus, didn't work out too well, but he's clearly a top player for club and country, not always in the Dutch starting lineup, but really good character as well. Bayern Munich hasn't gone as well as he would like, but even before recording this, I saw something about the Bayern fans petitioning for the club not to sell him to Manchester United. So yeah, there's a long-term sort of admiration there. Erik ten Hag clearly has brought it to the fore as one of his potential candidates as they look to strengthen in central defence after the departure of Rafael Varane. You may even see more departures. They had targets who appeared to be higher on the wish list, Jared Branthwaite, but £70 million is a figure I don't think Manchester United will go to. Everton don't want to sell him. They had a bid of £35 million plus £8 million in add-ons rejected. So that one's difficult. Then there's the pursuit of Lenny Yoro of Lille, but the expectation is he will end up at Real Madrid. Then there is Jean-Claire Todibo at OGC Nice, which Manchester United can't do because of their ownership conflict and the latest UEFA rules around that. And so somebody that may not have been like at the top of Manchester United's wish list inevitably climbs up it and becomes the most realistic prospect. And that's what we revealed on The Athletic last week. It would appear that conversations have moved on. I think my colleague Dan Sheldon reported that the clubs are now in dialogue, Manchester United and Bayern Munich. If he is to come, he would be a more realistic price than somebody like Branthwaite, although there would be a salary difference and there's agents' commissions to consider as well. But it's one that's being actively worked upon. I think Manchester United, in an ideal world, would look to bring in two central defenders. If they're to bring in a second one, now it's most likely that somebody would have to leave because of their financial situation and also squad space. Let's see what happens with the likes of Harry Maguire and Victor Lindelof. You would expect that Martinez would stay at the club. So yeah, that's a really interesting one. And this is all why I pointed out in the deal sheet this week that it's one to watch for this week, because these things tend to develop quite rapidly when all minds are on it. But let's see, because we also know that some of these transfers can come up as ideas, but then it can be a bit of a slow burner. A club can show resistance to part with a player. Others can come to the fore, but definitely it's one that Manchester United are very actively exploring.
Yeah, definitely recommend you guys keep your eye on the deal sheet for all your team's transfer news as well. David, Chris, thank you so much for your time. Look, if you're looking for more transfer news, as I said, remember to check out the deal sheet on The Athletic. If you're also into podcasts, don't forget, the Totally Football Show has reaction from the Euros, and our daily football briefing brings you all the news from both the Euros and Copa America inside just 10 minutes throughout the summer. We'll be back tomorrow for a deep dive into one of the day's biggest stories. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.